Good morning, everyone, and I'm very pleased to be moderating a panel on right to counsel for tenants facing eviction as part of WRO's Fair Housing Symposium. As Marlene said, I retired as CEO of Legal Services of the Hudson Valley a few months ago, but I remain committed to working on the issue of right to counsel in housing matters for low-income tenants because it is such a critical need, not only in Westchester County, but throughout the entire state. All basic human needs are at risk when low-income tenants face eviction. Those needs include shelter, income, mental and physical health and well-being, and child custody. Evictions are a primary cause of homelessness, and guaranteeing legal representation for low-income tenants is a proven means of curbing evictions for those tenants. While the COVID-19 pandemic created never-before-seen public health and economic consequences, which have cost low-income people their jobs and ability to pay rent, the epidemic of evictions from rental housing has been a long-standing problem in Westchester County that is being addressed. In 2019, almost 10,000 tenants faced eviction proceedings in Westchester's 5 city courts, and there are unknown number of tenants facing evictions in town and village courts because those records are not computerized and they cannot really be compiled. Eviction proceedings are unfair and unbalanced. They can be complicated, but when the tenant doesn't have a lawyer, the odds are stacked against them. And in Westchester County, 92% of landlords have attorneys and 8% of tenants have attorneys. And so the shelter system is overcrowded, evictions continue to take place, and it costs the county up to $78,000 a year to house a homeless family, and much less to keep them in their apartments. So today we're going to be addressing the question of right to counsel in eviction proceedings, and we have 3 wonderful panelists, expert panelists. You will hear from Neil Steinkamp, Managing Director, Transformative Change Consulting at Strout. Neil is a nationally recognized expert and consultant. You will also hear from Jason Mays, Director of Litigation at the Hudson Valley Justice Center and co-chair of Westchester County's Right to Counsel Coalition. And you'll hear from Malika Connor, the Director of Organizing for the Right to Counsel New York City Coalition. Malika is an experienced community organizer, campaign strategist, and social worker. Now we're going to turn to our first panelist. I think all 3 panelists will be seen at the same time, but the first panelist to do his presentation is Neil Steinkamp.
Thank you, Barbara, and thank you to WRO for inviting me and this panel together on this important topic, and good morning to everyone. I'm really going to talk about what we see from the Right to Counsel movement nationwide, and some of the work that Stout has done to look at the results of eviction right to counsel so far, and some of the impacts, particularly fiscal. I know our other speakers will talk about some of the other important intersections related to eviction and homelessness, but also race as well. We know that eviction is also an issue of race in this country. It disproportionately affects communities of color and women as well, and I know those are important topics also. Let me touch on where we are nationwide in a right to counsel for low-income tenants facing eviction, or all tenants facing eviction, frankly. Bear in mind, 4 years ago, there was not a jurisdiction in America that provided a right to counsel for tenants facing eviction. Just 4 years ago, that number was 0. Today, there are 8 jurisdictions across the country that have already passed a right to counsel for tenants facing eviction. The first of those in 2017 was New York City, passing, which I know everyone on this call is certainly very familiar with, passing legislation for tenants at 200% of the federal poverty level or below, and looking to expand that now. A program with a 5-year implementation track, which was accelerated during the pandemic. And I think that is a real testament to the city's both commitment to a right to counsel, but also its importance and its efficacy, to have a city like New York City recognizing its importance and the ways in which it could help address some of the issues during the pandemic, and the ways that right to counsel can do that is a great testament to its impact. In 2018, San Francisco becomes the second city. There is no income eligibility in San Francisco for their right to counsel. All tenants who are not able to afford a lawyer have access to counsel in San Francisco. Later that year, Newark, New Jersey becomes the third, and in September of 2019, Cleveland becomes the fourth city in the country to pass a right to counsel. In November of 2019, Philadelphia is the next city to pass a right to counsel, and in November, later that month, in November, Boulder, Colorado, through a ballot initiative, passes a right to counsel, the first jurisdiction to do so through a ballot initiative. In December of 2020, really not long ago, Baltimore passed its right to counsel. And just earlier this month, Seattle became the 8th jurisdiction to pass a right to counsel. Really great diversity. You've got East Coast and West Coast. You have some Midwestern cities there. Really, I think a strong recognition of the importance of right to counsel in each of those jurisdictions, some through city council, some through ballot initiative, but tremendous progress over the last 4 years. As we sit here today, we have 2 states who are really on the verge of statewide right to counsel, which is a tremendous next step. And again, I think a real reflection of the impact of right to counsel. Washington State and Maryland. Maryland has passed both the Senate and House in Maryland. It's sitting on the governor's desk now. So we're going to see a state, maybe 2 here in the next several weeks. And then you have a number of other states with right to counsel legislation pending. Nebraska, Minnesota, Indiana, South Carolina, Connecticut, Massachusetts, and soon Delaware are all states that are also evaluating right to counsel legislation. So again, a great representation of the importance of this issue and the ways in which a right to counsel really changes the system. We'll talk a little bit about that as well. A few things on what we know from the benefits of a right to counsel so far. In New York City, tenant representation has increased from 1% to 38%. As Barbara mentioned earlier, in Westchester, just 8% representation rate right now. The average across the country is closer to 3%. But really remarkably, the latest statistics from New York City, 38% tenant representation in 2020. As a result, the Office of Civil Justice in New York City, as many of you may know, does publish an annual report. 86% of the tenants who are represented through the Right to Counsel program remain in their homes. 86% remain in their homes. As Barbara said, it is an effective resource to keep people in their homes. And by keeping people in their homes, you are avoiding the other negative outcomes, including as a pathway to homelessness, but many other forms of trauma that result from the eviction process. 98% of the tenants represented in administrative termination of tenancy proceedings were able to stay in their homes. Martial evictions in New York City declined 6% from 2018 to 2019, 15% from 2019 to 2020, and are down 41% since 2013 when the initial funding for expanding tenant representation began. Eviction filings themselves have declined 20% just in 1 year, 2019 to 2020, and 30% since 2013. Again, a reflection of the system change that a right to counsel brings. When everyone knows that the tenants will be represented and have access to a lawyer, you find that there are fewer filings because there are many filings right now that just don't need to be brought whatsoever. Default judgments in New York City down 34% since 2013. Very, very similar metrics, I won't go through all of them, but very similar metrics in San Francisco, seeing great progress in terms of keeping people in their homes, reduction in filings, reduction in default rates, same thing in Cleveland through their right to counsel program. Particularly right now, right to counsel is an additional sort of element to think about with respect to right to counsel is its importance in connecting residents to other services. So the legal defenses that are provided, of course, are incredibly important. But right now, particularly related to the complexity of rental assistance programs, lawyers can be helpful in making sure that residents have access to and can navigate very complicated application programs and processes in order to help them stay in their homes through a phenomenal, not really a historic amount of rental assistance that is now available. So lawyers become particularly important in being able to help navigate those systems as well. And we've seen really tremendous improvement in terms of how the courts have responded to right to counsel, and also how landlords have responded to right to counsel. Those jurisdictions that have enacted and implemented right to counsel, landlords do find that it is a valuable program and platform as well. Just a few things in terms of the impacts. Not only are you keeping people in your homes, but as a result, you're reducing homelessness, you're reducing job loss and employment instability, you're improving the ability to re-rent. Eviction, there's a scarlet E, it becomes very hard to re-rent as a result of a prior eviction. You're improving mental and physical health. There are many studies that show that. You're reducing instances of suicide, excess mortality, and other trauma from the eviction process. You're keeping kids in school because chronic absenteeism is deeply interconnected with housing instability and eviction. Child welfare and foster care systems, less entry into those as well, and just general community stability. As a result of all those things, what I typically focus on is trying to measure the economic impact of that. And in every jurisdiction in which we've measured that, which includes New York City, LA, Baltimore, Philadelphia, and others, you see that it is a phenomenal investment. At least $3 of return for every dollar invested in a right to counsel, because you are reducing shelter entries, you are improving school attendance, you have fewer students who are experiencing homelessness that you are supporting, you're improving and reducing emergency mental health entry as well. So many fiscal impacts and social safety nets for which we can prevent entry into those systems by keeping people in safe and stable housing. It's a great fiscal investment from that perspective. So I'll end my remarks there. Happy to answer questions through the Q&A, and Barbara, I'll hand it back to you.
Thanks, Neil. Thanks. That was very informative. And I know there'll be questions after the other presenters present their parts. Jason Mays, Director of Litigation at Hudson Valley Justice Center.
Hello, everyone. Yes, I'm Jason Mays.
Good morning.
I'm also the co-chair of the Westchester County Right to Counsel Coalition. That's a group of about 25 nonprofits, faith leaders, housing providers, legal services providers. We're all urging Westchester County to pass a bill similar to the bill that was passed in New York City. We've drafted a bill, and legislators have expressed interest, but no one has sponsored it yet. One of the reasons is that we've this year the county agreed to fund a study to, kind of estimate the cost of this program. The county has not implemented that study yet. When we talk to them, they cite prioritizing the response to COVID, and that's reasonable, but we hope that they can get started on that. In terms of what we're doing, we're just urging people who agree that the county should do this to contact their legislators, and we have an online petition, and we've made it really easy for people to contact their legislators and let them know that they support this. Barbara mentioned the need here in Westchester. 10,000 eviction cases filed in a normal year. 93% of landlords represented, 7% of tenants are represented. The courts are incredibly overburdened. So if you go to somewhere like Yonkers City Court or Mount Vernon City Court, you will see people crowded into the courtrooms. Usually people are outside of the courtrooms. The court officer has to call people in whenever their case is called because they can't all fit in the seats. Often it's single mothers with their children in the hallways. In 2019, 5,000 people entered the Westchester County shelter system, and 2,900 of those were new to the shelter system. The county spent $38 million housing those people in 2019. Obviously, in 2020, things are going to be different. And Neil talked a little bit about the trauma that this causes families. It interrupts children's schooling, it makes it harder for people to rent apartments, and it's a significant financial setback for already struggling families. So I guess the question is, what can attorneys do for people who are facing eviction? A lot of people think that all evictions are just about rent, right? That's not always true. There are many cases where tenants face discrimination from their landlords. You'll hear a presentation about the Fair Housing Act and how that people who are victims of discrimination and harassment have greater rights than other tenants. And but they won't be able to assert those rights in court without attorneys, right? Most of it. We've had clients who were, the landlord alleges that they've caused a nuisance, right? Well, when we investigated, it turns out that the person was a victim of domestic violence, and the reason the police were showing up at their house was because there was domestic violence happening, and the person got a order of protection against the offender and was able to stay in their home. That probably wouldn't happen without an attorney. Even when the eviction isn't about rent, though, attorneys can help. Oftentimes, eviction petitions include fees that shouldn't become part of an eviction case, right? So late fees, parking fees, attorney's fees, these will be added on to the petition. And if there isn't an attorney to go through and make sure that those are removed, the tenant would have to pay that to stay. And if the tenant is getting assistance from DSS or something like that, that's more money that we all have to pay to keep that person housed because the landlord is inflating the judgment. Also, tenants in every landlord-tenant relationship in New York, there is an implied warranty of habitability. And if a delinquent landlord allows the property to fall into disrepair, doesn't make certain necessary conditions, the tenant is entitled to a rent abatement. The tenants can't assert that defense, obviously, on their own. They need attorneys to do that. And if we can make the delinquent landlords who are not making repairs, maintain their property, then we're preserving the housing stock. We're making sure that the housing stock isn't shrinking, and we're also making sure that tenants aren't paying more than they are obligated to pay under the law. Also, like Neil said, attorneys can help connect tenants to financial services that they need to pay the rent. And this helps the landlords, right? I mean, the money goes through the tenant's hands immediately, but goes right into the landlord's hands and helps the landlord pay the mortgage. So oftentimes landlords are helping gather the money that the tenant needs, that ultimately the landlord needs. So if you factor all of this in and consider the offsets that we would experience if fewer people are going into the shelter system, the county isn't paying so much to house people through the quite expensive shelter program, we could see that this program could potentially pay for itself. My office received some funds from the federal government at the end of last year, and we were able to, on average, reduce the amount of payments that we made by 13%. So the landlord would say, the tenant owes X amount of money. We on average paid 13% less than what the landlord originally said through negotiating with the landlords, through asserting defenses based on conditions, through removing late fees and other charges that shouldn't belong. So we can see how this kind of program could potentially pay for itself, which is why we need the county to get moving on that study that they've budgeted, because obviously everybody wants to know how much a program like this is going to cost. And we think it would be cost effective, but also we just want to say that regardless of that we believe people should have attorneys as a matter of fairness and justice, right? So there are certain kinds of legal proceedings that people can face in which we have decided our legal system will not impose a penalty or impose a judgment on that person if they don't have an attorney. If a person's liberty is at stake because they're facing criminal charges, we won't impose a penalty on that person if they don't have an attorney, right? And in New York, if custody of your children is at stake, if you can't afford an attorney, one will be provided to you, because we know that's such a momentous decision. It shouldn't be made without someone in the defendant's corner who's an expert who can assert their defenses and make sure that they're making the right decision. And we just hope that people will soon think of evictions in that category, something that is traumatic, something that we need to take a careful look at, and we need to make sure that the decision that leads to an eviction is correct. And the only way to do that is to give the tenants an attorney. So that's all I have to say.
Well, that was great. Thank you, Jason. And just to repeat, what Jason said, evictions are really not just about rental arrears. And I think that repeats what Neil said and Jason said, and we'll hear from Malika. But I think that just paying rental arrears is really compounding the problem. And in order to have a holistic, comprehensive system, there have to be many factors included, not just paying rental arrears, but having lawyers for tenants. And in Westchester County, I mean, tenants just don't think that they have any rights. I practiced for quite a while, and Jason has told you what he sees when he goes into court. The tenants just think they have to negotiate, a settlement and agree to pay rent that they may not owe, or not assert any defenses because they don't have representation and the court process is so quick. And so just morally and, fiscally, making sure that tenants have lawyers in addition to paying rental arrears is just the best outcome for not only the tenants and the communities, but for the government at every level. So let's hear from Malika Connor now. I think she's with us.
Yes, thank you, Barbara.
Hi, Malika.
Hi, good morning, everyone. I'm Malika. I'm the Director of Organizing with the Right to Counsel New York City Coalition. And I'm going to talk a little bit about our campaign to win a right to counsel in New York City, and how we won it and kind of what's next for the campaign. So we are a tenant-led coalition that formed in 2014 to change housing courts, prevent displacement, and stop the eviction crisis that, threatens our families, our neighborhoods, and our homes. Our coalition is made up of tenants, organizers, advocates, and legal services organizations, and many more. We believe that right to counsel isn't just about ensuring tenants have attorneys in housing court. For us, it's also about fighting to reclaim our city and our communities, to keep people housed in their homes and to denormalize the violence of evictions, right? The trauma that Jason talked about. And we're also building campaigns to create an eviction-free New York, and ultimately a right to housing. So as folks have mentioned, right to counsel is about more than rent, and it helps address the power imbalance between tenants and landlords that exists in housing court in particular, as well as the gender and racial inequities that often dictate who is evicted. And because our work is grounded in a history of tenant organizing and a belief that housing is a human right, after winning the right to counsel in 2017, we're now working to ensure that the law is implemented in a way that upholds that right, that builds tenant power, and that continues to transform the nature of the courts. So how did we win? After a hard-fought 3-year grassroots campaign in which tenants testified, rallied, marched, signed petitions, and so much more, we won and became the first city in the nation to establish a right to counsel for tenants facing eviction. And as Neil mentioned, our campaign has inspired a movement across the country, which is really powerful. Our coalition is tenant-led and driven by tenant organizing. And, for us and many other organizing groups, process matters in organizing. So it's not just about passing the right to counsel law. For us, the campaign, it was also about how we passed it. So our goal was to build a strong coalition and movement where tenants are leading the work and making decisions, and working in collaboration with attorneys and advocates in the fight. So, building a strong coalition entailed bringing in and developing tenant leaders, training movement lawyers, right? Not just to represent tenants in court, but also to be part of the movement, and to, really see the value in making sure that there was that more equal balance of power within the courts. And also creating space within our coalition for both the tenant organizing work and the legal work. So, I also want to emphasize that right to counsel, the campaign that we run was really powerful. And for us, right to counsel has to be passed as a right, not as a program or a service that could be changed by fluctuating budgets, or by legislators that are coming in and out of office, right? It has to fundamentally be a right. So Neil touched on this a little bit, but I just wanted to go over kind of what we won, and how it kind of rolled out. So the right to counsel law was signed in August 2017, and it means that tenants who are sued for eviction in housing court and who are income eligible So at 200% of the federal poverty level, have a right to an attorney to defend their case. It doesn't matter what kind of eviction case they have or what kind of tenant they are. So they can have a Section 8 voucher, live in a house, be rent stabilized, be a public housing tenant. All of those folks are eligible for right to counsel. And if the tenant is over income in New York City, they do have a right to legal consultation or an advice session. And the current law, when it was passed, it included a 5-year phase-in plan and would have been fully implemented by next summer. But as Neil mentioned, the city decided to fully phase it in during the pandemic, which was great. And before the pandemic, the coalition was running campaigns to expand and strengthen right to counsel, right? Because we have right to counsel for low-income tenants, but not everyone who needs it is included. So we were running campaigns to raise the income eligibility limit to 400% of the federal poverty line, so more tenants have the right to counsel, and also pushing the city to fund tenant organizing so that tenants know about their rights. And that they're supported in, building their tenant associations and in navigating the courts and all of those things. And so when the pandemic started, we quickly shifted our focus to keeping the courts closed and fighting for an eviction moratorium, among other things, and deeply engaging and supporting eviction defense work, alongside the powerful movement attorneys that are part of our coalition. And this year, we're also working on a statewide right to counsel campaign. So, due to the pandemic, more than 1.2 million New Yorkers across the state are unable to pay rent and are at risk of losing their homes. Tenants in parts of the state outside of New York City have fewer tenant protections, right? And while in New York City, we're fighting to change housing court, in the rest of the state, many tenants can't proactively sue their landlords in court for repairs. Right, they have to wait until a landlord brings an eviction case against them in order to address those housing condition issues. And so, that also just shows us how much the scales of power are tipped in the direction of landlords who have attorneys while tenants don't. So there's a tremendous need for right to counsel statewide, and passing the legislation at the state level will strengthen right to counsel in New York City and also create right to counsel for tenants outside of New York City who don't have that right at all. So that bill includes funding for tenant organizing, funding for attorneys, and right to counsel for everyone facing eviction, so no income or geographic limits. And right now, we're working on securing sponsors for that statewide bill, and we'll be launching the campaign in the coming weeks. So that's all I have. I guess I'll turn it back over to Barbara.
I have to unmute myself. Thanks, Malika. And thanks for working on the statewide effort, because we really need that. I just wanted to add to what Malika said, that this would be a perfect time for the county and the state to really fund right to counsel efforts, because there is federal funding available. And I was on a webinar last week, I think Malika and Jason were also on, and there are 3 federal funding streams that can be used. I'm not going to get into the details. If anyone wants to know, you can ask WRO, I can send out material. But there are federal funding streams that will last for at least 3 years that can be used to fund attorneys to provide representation to tenants, and that is being utilized throughout the country. It is not being utilized in Westchester County right now, but it could be. And I think Jason, wanted to add another comment.
I just wanted to say something about Westchester that not everyone knows. You've probably heard of Legal Services of the Hudson Valley, which is a huge organization and does a lot of great work. But because of the federal funding that Legal Services of the Hudson Valley receives, they can't represent undocumented tenants, right? So my office, which has 3 full-time attorneys, is the only office that can represent all of the undocumented tenants in Westchester, which is obviously not enough, right? We need more attorneys who can represent undocumented folks. And I just wanted to say that we're in this time where there's this pandemic. It's stopped everyone from working, and we can obviously sympathize with people who are not able to pay rent. More than ever, we can say, we can look at someone who can't pay rent because of this pandemic and say, there before the grace of God go by, that kind of like sympathy that we might have. But I have to say, virtually all of my clients who can't pay rent were prevented from paying rent through some event outside their control, right? So usually when I have a tenant who can't pay rent, it's because of some kind of medical emergency or family emergency or work emergency or something like that that prevented them from paying rent. They're not just, not paying rent because they just don't want to or whatever. So, I mean, I just hope that we can use this to think differently about how we, we view people who are for some reason falling behind, because it's always, virtually in my experience, because of something outside the tenant's control.
Thanks, Jason. So are there any questions in the Q&A? Let me see. We have 2 questions, I see.
Where can tenants go to access government or private funds? They should begin by going to DSS, the local Department of Social Services. Even if they don't qualify for assistance there, they will probably need a denial from DSS to go to the other organizations. And DSS should provide them with a list of other providers like Catholic Charities, the Bridge Fund, my office. That's where they should go to access that.
And the second question is, do the panelists present their information for other groups, organizations? If so, what is their contact information? I think that yes, the answer is definitely yes. And I think that all the panelists can provide their information in the chat or answer the Q&A. I mean, I know Malika certainly, presents information throughout the state, and I know, is working on the statewide effort. And Neil is a national expert. Neil, did you want to speak?
I was just going to say there is a link to the speaker bios in the chat. Folks click on that, you'll see a link to the speaker bios as contact information, as well as a few other links that may be valuable resources for folks as well.
Let me see if there's any other questions. Okay. Will there be a segment for home ownership? I'm not quite sure. Okay. Andrew's going to answer that.
Yeah, I apologize. I don't think we don't have a separate segment in today's discussions on home ownership, but WRO, as well as other organizations in the county, does have a first-time home ownership program, and we're always happy to talk to anyone about how that program works and the benefits of joining it.
Oh, is there any theory that could support a tenant's action against their landlord for failure to keep the apartment physically?
I can answer that. So in New York City, there is a special housing part that where a tenant can initiate an action against the landlord whose apartment is failing to meet certain standards. Outside of the city, the tenant has to go through the local Department of Buildings or the local code enforcement office and have that office issue violations. And that office has to essentially lead any action against the landlord. So if that code enforcement officer finds that there are violations and they need to be repaired, that code enforcement officer generally has to begin the proceeding in city court. Tenants can withhold rent because of conditions, but they're at risk of the landlord beginning a non-payment proceeding against them. Then they may have to put money into escrow, and the rights outside of the city are not great. But there is a bill that's being sponsored right now called the Housing Dignity and Safe Housing Act or something like that. Maybe we can put it in the chat, but it would expand the HP action outside of the city to the whole state. We fully support that, and we think other people should too.
Thanks, Jason. I just, we only have a few minutes left, but I wanted to emphasize, what Neil said in his presentation, and I encourage people to look at the studies that Neil has done throughout the country. And I think in the 6 minutes that he had, he certainly, couldn't really go over all the factors that he includes when he does an assessment of the impact of right to counsel in the various jurisdictions where he's done the studies. The number of factors that he includes when he considers how much not just the cost effectiveness for the county and the state or the federal government, but also the impact on families and communities is really astronomical. And that's why, we were hopeful, that the county would fund and undertake a study so that because the question has been asked and answered throughout the entire country, that, providing counsel for tenants in eviction proceedings is not only saving, I think Neil said $3 for every dollar spent, but also really preventing tenants and communities from the trauma that evictions pose. And Neil, I don't know if you just want to take a few minutes and expand on your studies.
Yeah, thanks, Barbara. I'm happy to. Of course, so first of all, they're all available. There's a link in the chat. Feel free to take a look. There'll be another one soon. I don't want to be a spoiler, but stay tuned on that. At the low end of the range is a $3 return on investment. We've in some jurisdictions, we've seen $6, $7, $8, $10 of return. It really, there's no cookie cutter approach. You have to look at the social safety nets in each jurisdiction, but consistently it is a significant value to the jurisdiction. So you take, for example, just the shelter system. As you said, Barbara, in your opening remarks, it's extremely expensive to maintain a shelter system. And study after study after study has shown that eviction is a pathway to homelessness. Any survey, any of the intake surveys that are done by shelter systems are typically asking, what are some of the reasons why you are here today? And at least 25% of people in most shelter systems across the country directly attribute their shelter entry to a prior eviction. It may not have been yesterday, it may have been some time before, but they will tell you that it was eviction. I had nowhere to go after I was evicted. And once you are in the shelter system, it is extremely expensive to then transition people back to safe and stable housing thereafter. And as Jason said earlier, it's often an unexpected event. We have, low-income families are on average $400 away from not being able to have anything. That's all that is there in terms of flexible discretionary savings. And again, studies have shown that. So the cost of providing representation is far less, and the values are significant across so many different systems. And so our studies will look at both the cost of providing the services. Of course, it depends on the jurisdiction and the ways in which the courts and the dockets are sort of indicating the volume of cases and their dispositions and things like that. So we look at that, measure what would the cost of representation be, working with the providers to understand what their budgets and models of representation look like. And then we do a lot of research and frankly stakeholder outreach to talk to these jurisdictions. We'll talk to the school districts and the shelter systems and the foster care systems and the healthcare systems and try to understand how are their constituents impacted by eviction. And then we'll work with the grassroots organizers, the community groups to understand how their clients, their constituents are impacted by eviction. And really consistently across all of those, the stakeholders, both at the grassroots level and at sort of the institutional level across the counties, will tell you that absolutely, if you can prevent people from entering this system, whatever it is, if you can provide housing stability, it has a huge effect. I've met with school districts who have said the number one issue that their students face, or urban school districts who will tell you the number one issue that students face is eviction, because it creates an erosive, it erodes all of the stability that is necessary on which to provide learning. Chronic absenteeism, dropout rates are much higher for students who experience homelessness. So across all these systems that we all are, the counties and cities across the nation are spending so much to try to maintain and provide those reactive services to. This is a model that prevents the need to do that. And obviously, not only is there a fiscal element, as Jason and Malika and Barbara have all said, there's a reason to do this because it's the right thing to keep people safely housed so that they can prevent the trauma of this housing instability. But surely, just from a fiscal perspective, it makes a ton of sense.
Okay, thank you. I think our time is up. And I'm going to turn it back over to Andrew or Marlene. Thanks to the panelists. That was a terrific panel. Thank you.
Thank you all so much, Barbara, Malika, Neil, and Jason. We really appreciate your thoughtfulness and leadership on this issue. Such a critical in terms of access to justice, as well as just homelessness prevention. So much.